Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to another edition of Fighting Game Thursday. Today we are going to be looking at the history of a game that has been heavily requested on this channel ever since I first started putting up fighting game videos. The game in question that we are going to focus on within this upload is a title that is arguably the most important fighting game to have been released in the 21st century, and a game that is so important that a strong case could be made for it to have saved fighting games as we know them. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Street Fighter 4, the game that saved the Street Fighter franchise. Yeah! The story of the rise of Street Fighter 4 is an intriguing one, particularly when you take into account the position that the Street Fighter franchise was in prior to the game's release, with a dramatic rise and slow decline in popularity taking place for the intellectual property. If we take ourselves all the way back to 1987 to the release of the original Street Fighter title, the game was a commercial success and critically well received. Sure, the game didn't feature all the fighting game tropes we know and love today, but for its time, the title ticked all of Capcom's success boxes, so a sequel would be a no-brainer, as Capcom could see that there was potential to carry on making money from the franchise. In 1989, Capcom would have developed a game originally known as Street Fighter 89. This high-quality side-scrolling beat-em-up was heavily inspired by Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, and was first shown off at arcade trade shows, but was quickly rebranded to be known as Final Fight, after the game received criticism for being too different to the original Street Fighter game. The true sequel to Street Fighter arrived in 1991. This was an arcade game known as Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior. This game would obviously be, as you know, a cultural phenomenon, and would prove to be so popular that it would somewhat rejuvenate the arcade industry and create a renaissance period after the world of arcades had seen a long slump. Past this point, the history of the franchise gets a little crazy, as rather than simply move into the development of Street Fighter 3, the next obvious name to call a title in the series, instead Capcom would release multiple revisions of the original Street Fighter 2 game. By 1994, the game had been revised on 4 separate occasions, finally leading to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Capcom were milking the game for all it was worth. You would assume going further forward, Capcom would finally give the fans the true sequel everyone wanted, a game known as Street Fighter 3. However, this wasn't to happen quite yet, and instead, Capcom chose to hold their cards close to their chest and save that hand for a later date. Rather than a game named Street Fighter 3, Capcom would release Street Fighter Alpha. This game was neither a sequel nor was it a prequel. Street Fighter Alpha would be made an midquel, set halfway between Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2. The game's roster was made up of a combination of fighters from both games and included a few new ones too. Street Fighter Alpha would be treated in much of the same way as Street Fighter 2, in that it too would see multiple revisions such as Alpha 2 and Alpha 3, which tweaked the mechanics and expanded the game's roster size. Whilst the Alpha series was in production, other Street Fighter titles were being released, but there was still no sign of Street Fighter 3 yet. Amongst these we had the Street Fighter the movie games, that were not particularly well received. These featured graphics similar to the Mortal Kombat games. By 1996, Capcom would develop X-Men vs Street Fighter, the exciting game which would see characters from X-Men and Street Fighter face off. The concept wowed consumers and proved successful enough to launch a whole series of games in its own right, popularly referred to as the Capcom vs series. That same year would also see the release of Street Fighter EX, the first game from the franchise to use 3D polygons. The game was developed by Arika, rather than Capcom, as Capcom felt they could not do the series justice in 3D due to not having the resources at their own company to do so. The game was an important step, as after the release of the Sony PlayStation, Tekken was quickly carving out a niche for itself as the most played fighting game in the world. The series, with its smooth for its time 3D graphics, paired with its easy to learn pick up and play controls, was a world beater, and as a result quickly became a more appealing fighting game franchise amongst the mainstream. By 1997, the success of Tekken and other new fighting games would finally cause Capcom to pull their finger out of their arse and actually release Street Fighter 3. the game people had craved 6 years earlier. By this point in time, the majority of consumers had tired of the brand and were chronologically confused with regards to where they stood with the franchise. Street Fighter 3 was very clearly not the third game of the series, but more like the 20th. So Capcom would have to try and do something rather special if they wanted consumers to view this game as the true successor to Street Fighter 2, the game they had built an entire empire on to begin with. The average fan of the franchise and video game critics wanted Street Fighter 3 to contain all of their favourite characters and fighting mechanics, but in an impressive 3D environment. Capcom though rather stubbornly took the polar opposite approach and developed another 2D entry in the series, which allegedly at first was set to feature no cast members from Street Fighter 2. Fan backlash prior to this would see Ryu and Ken added to the game before its commercial release. Whilst the game arguably featured the most stunning 2D sprite work the world had ever seen at that point, 2D graphics were old news at that time and were quickly looking to become relics of the past. The game featured a small, mostly unfamiliar roster of fighters and featured controls and gameplay that were tough to learn, and which would mean the game would only really appeal to hardcore fighting game enthusiasts, rather than appealing to the mass market where all the actual money was. The advanced 2D sprites would also make the game unsuitable for any home hardware of the time, as consoles had very much shifted their focus to being equipped to run polygon-based games. This meant that the game would not make it home until the release of the Dreamcast, and although the game's revisions would expand on the small roster, which would resolve the poor character selection problem slightly, the game was not a Street Fighter game that many people were interested in. Despite the decline in interest in the Street Fighter brand and 2D fighting games as a whole, the Marvel vs Capcom series and Capcom vs SNK games were commercial successes and found strong followings. Capcom had done pretty much everything with this formula in 2D. So the next logical step would be to make a game crossing over characters from different Capcom fighting games, but this time in 3D. This resulted in the development of Capcom Fighting All-Stars, a game that was cancelled in August of 2003 after receiving negative feedback from players who were helping to beta test the game. Whilst the game was cancelled, many elements of this unreleased game would be recycled and used in future Capcom games. The first of these was a title we covered a few weeks ago on this channel, known as Capcom Fighting Evolution, a lazy effort that would be Capcom's last new fighting game to feature Street Fighter characters rendered as 2D sprites. Producer Yoshinori Ono has gone on to admit that the game was essentially a salvaged version of Capcom Fighting All-Stars, and has also stated how the crossover, mechanics and inclusion of the various gameplay systems inherent to each series led to balancing problems. The cancellation of Capcom Fighting All-Stars and the failings of Capcom Fighting Evolution led to somewhat of a dark age period for Capcom fighting games. There would be no significant releases in the genre by Capcom for another 4 years, which is a huge paradigm shift from when they were releasing half a dozen different fighters each and every year, just a few years earlier. During this period of reflection, and looking at what had gone wrong, the direction for the Street Fighter franchise was unclear, and executives at Capcom were split on the franchise's future. Yoshinori Ono, a producer working at Capcom, pitched the idea of Street Fighter 4 to Capcom's research and development head, Keiji Ifune. However, the prevailing attitude floating around Capcom in the mid-2000s was that a new numeric entry in the Street Fighter series should never be made, as it was viewed that the franchise was well and truly burnt out in that regard. The last new game to carry the Street Fighter title was Street Fighter EX3, released in the year 2000. And the game had been completely overshadowed and overlooked by the public in favour of Tekken Tag Tournament, and that is without looking at the failings of Street Fighter 3 and Capcom Fighting Evolution. Between EX3 and Street Fighter 4 there would be an 8-year gap between the two games, a gap in time which was the longest period ever without a true new entry in the series. Very interestingly though, despite the fact that fans were snubbing all of these new games, Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting received an extremely positive response when released in Xbox Live Arcade, proving there was still life in the brand, just not the direction Capcom had brought the franchise in over the last decade. I guess this was at a point in time where what we now refer to as retro gaming was really beginning to get popular. This was due to a combination of two main ingredients. Firstly, nostalgia was driving gamers to go back and play games from their past, and secondly, because gaming had moved on and progressed at such a pace that many developers had simply forgotten what makes a great game in the first place, and were instead relying on flashy graphics to sell products rather than focusing on actually fun games. Due to the fact that Street Fighter 2 was selling well once again, Inafune would change his stance completely onto production of Street Fighter 4, and ordered the development of a brand new Street Fighter game that mainly took influence from Street Fighter 2. Yoshi Ono was made producer of this conceptual title, who held experience working on Street Fighter 3 Third Strike as a sound management director, and rather infamously had produced Capcom Fighting Evolution. Due to the fact that the game was to be influenced by Capcom's past, one of the game's original concept titles was to be Street Fighter 4 Flashback, but the name never made it past proposal stage. This proposed version of the game was partly imagined by David Sirlin, a man who would go on to design Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix. This version of the game would have featured 2.5D gameplay and would have had a roster featuring all the Street Fighter 2 characters, along with Sakura and a few new ones. David's pitch also included a single player mode played from a third-person 3D action perspective, like that of a God of War game, where you played exclusively as Ryu. David also wanted the title to include the original forms of Street Fighter 2, as well as a 3D remake of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Another element proposed for this game was that it was to feature more simplistic controls than newer Street Fighter games, as the shift to more complex control schemes over the years had consistently continued to help put the mainstream market off of the Street Fighter brand. Whilst not many elements were used from this old proposal, the easy control scheme idea was implemented into Tatsunoko vs Capcom, Capcom's new crossover fighting game for the Wii, which was being worked on simultaneously at the same time as Street Fighter 4. The finalised version of the game would be co-developed by both Capcom and Dimps. Dimps is a company that was founded on March 6, 2000 by several former SNK and Capcom employees, including Street Fighter co-creator Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto. Takashi created the first ever Street Fighter game way back in 1987, and after leaving Capcom and jumping to SNK, went on to create Fatal Fury, as well as working on Art of Fighting and King of Fighters. In many ways, Takashi Nishiyama is the godfather of fighting games, so having his company involved in the development of Street Fighter 4 was a sensible move. In regards to the working relationship between Capcom and Dimps, Yoshinori Ono has stated in reference to Street Fighter 4 that we handled all the art, characters and game design within Capcom, and they handled the programming and balancing. Former Capcom community manager Seth Killian mentioned that he played Street Fighter 4 very near the start of its development in 2006, but initially was not quite sure whether or not the project would go as to plan. He says, "So while I was ecstatic that the game was going to exist, my first impression wasn't great. They had two characters in a partially playable form, but the transition to 3D models was very difficult. But we worked hard to make sure the community had many chances to try it before release. By the time we launched in 2009, everyone felt confident that Street Fighter 4 had the magic needed to get people street fighting again." The finalised design for Street Fighter 4 ended up featuring models and backgrounds both rendered in 3D. However, the gameplay remained on a traditional 2D plane, just like in Street Fighter 2. Despite this, like with many fighting games that came before it, Street Fighter 4 features a moving camera to catch the action from various angles to make all of the action on screen appear more dramatic. This technique was nothing new for the Street Fighter franchise though, as Ariga had used the same effect previously within their EX series. There was a stage in the game's development that the game was going to feature 3D hitboxes, however it did not come with the accuracy of previous games, so was switched back to the pixel perfect 2D hitboxes. One of the striking features of Street Fighter 4 is the game's three-dimensional art style. A lot had changed since the release of Street Fighter EX3 8 years earlier, and in 2008, developers could finally make 3D games look beautiful. The fantastic 3D art in the game was inspired by Arc System Works' Battle Fantasia, and the game's art director and character designer Daigo Ikeno did not want to try to design the game to look photorealistic, as felt that games of that style did not age well over time. The man, who had previously worked on Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, gave characters a hand-drawn look and included visual effects such as ink smudges and ink sprays during fights, to further punctuate this look. It was quite a bold move, come to think of it. A gentleman known as Hideyuki Fukasawa was put in charge of the game's music, who had previously worked on the Onimusha series. The game's soundtrack would consist of both new and old material, with rearranged versions of old tracks being created to appeal to the legions of fans who love Street Fighter 2. The game would finally release firstly in arcades in July of 2008 in Japan, with North American and European arcades importing the machine by August. The title would run on a Taito Type X2 board, which would be housed inside a Taito Viewlix cabinet. The Type X2 was different to previous Street Fighter arcade boards, in that it had network capabilities, allowing players using separate machines to fight against one another via the use of local area network connections. The arcade version of Street Fighter 4 was voted Best Game of 2008 in Japan by the editorial staff of Arcadia magazine. The game also won in the categories of Best Graphics, Best Production and the Reader's Choice Award. The character, Ryu, took the #1 spot in the magazine's top 20 characters of 2008 in the same issue. The game would make it home on both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 worldwide in February of 2009, with the Windows version of the game also becoming available by the summer of that same year. Like all Street Fighter games, Street Fighter 4 follows a loose story. Hilariously, whilst the game is the 4th mainline entry in the series, the game is yet another mid-quel like Street Fighter Alpha. To make things chronologically confusing, the events of Street Fighter 4 occur in between the story of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3. So the game takes place shortly after M. Bison surviving his encounter with Akuma at the end of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. The only reason stories are of relevance really in Street Fighter is that they help shape the playable roster of fighters and give the game more of a reason to originally include a roster of fighters that is very Street Fighter 2 heavy. Speaking of the roster, the original arcade version of the game would include all 12 of the original characters who featured in Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior, as well as including a selection of brand new characters to mix the game up a bit. These would include the debuts of Abel, a French mixed martial artist, Seed Viper, a female American spy, Rufus, a rotund kung fu fighter who seeks to fight Ken to be recognised as the best fighter in America, and my favourite, El Thirte, a Mexican luchador who is an aspiring gourmet cook. It's super dynamic cooking time! The game would also include boss fighters in the form of Seth, the game's new main villain who has a modified body developed through advanced technology. Akuma also appears, continuing his trend as a secret final boss encounter, and Guken, the older brother of Akuma, who has been placed in the game as a tribute to the Shenlong hoax, a hoax that was accidentally initiated by poor translation from Japanese to English within Street Fighter 2. When the game made it out of the arcades, further characters would be added to the game, including Feelong and Cammy, two of the favourites who were introduced in Super Street Fighter 2, along with Dan, Rose and Sakura of Street Fighter Alpha fame. Gen 2 would also be added to the roster, a character who initially appeared in the 1987 Street Fighter game, but would become more well known when he was included in Street Fighter Alpha. Now we've covered all of the fighters who appeared in these versions of the game, let us talk more about the game's actual gameplay. As mentioned earlier, Yoshinori Ono's goal was to create a modern game that tried its best to look new and fresh, but have a lot of callbacks to what made Street Fighter 2 so great in the first place. To help give the game a more modern and cinematic edge, short pre-fight intro scenes containing dialogue sequences are added to the beginning of fights that vary depending on which characters are facing off against one another. The game features a very traditional 6-button control scheme and is mechanically very similar to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo in terms of gameplay. However, a couple of brand new fighting systems were introduced in this title known as Focus Attacks and Ultra Moves, which we shall quickly cover. Focus Attacks let the player absorb an attack and launch a counter-attack. This occurs in 2 phases. In phase 1, opponents' moves can be absorbed by holding down a button combination. During this phase, damage is still taken by the player. However, life lost from these oncoming assaults is regenerated if phase 2 is executed properly. Even special moves can be cancelled and converted into focus attacks, however only at the cost of 2 bars from the super combo gauge. With regards to the new focus attack system, Ono has stated that it was incorporated in order to shift the emphasis away from combos and towards a more realistic system he has compared to boxing, in which the skill is in reading your opponent's moves before he or she starts moving. We haven't forgotten about combos and link moves, but focus makes it so that you have to read your opponent. The game contains powered up versions of special moves introduced in previous Street Fighter games, including super combos and EX moves, but as mentioned earlier, we also have ultra combos, which are new to the franchise. These ultra combos are long cinematic moves featuring a lengthy combination of punches, kicks and other fighting techniques. As well as traditional super combo gauges, the game now also has additional gauges, known as revenge meters, which is what needs to be filled to be able to pull off an ultra combo. In this game, super gauges are filled up via damaging an opponent, whereas the revenge meters are filled via taking damage instead, giving players the chance for revenge if you were. Street Fighter 4 would also mark the first Street Fighter game in the series to include extra downloadable content. The first expansion pack, titled Championship Mode, was released free of charge in April of 2009. It provides players with a replay mode, a new point system and an enhanced tournament matching system. In addition, 5 more paid DLC packs were also offered to consumers, all of which consisted of alternative costumes for players to fight in. DLC and smooth 3D art style were not the only things that had massively changed in the gaming scene a lot since the release of the new Street Fighter game. Yoshinoro states that, thanks to the advent of the internet, players could now challenge each other online, get their games delivered digitally, and enjoy unprecedented access to events and tournaments. All of these advances mixed with the excitement of the players themselves to create a whole new scene. So, with this new game's release, a modern title heavily based off of Street Fighter 2, what did the critics and journalists make of this release? Let us find out. GameSpot would state that it's obvious that each iteration of the long-running Street Fighter series has been carefully tuned and tweaked to the finest degree, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Street Fighter 4. Street Fighter 4 isn't a success simply because it's one of the most technically complex 2D fighters ever made. It's a success because it's also wrapped inside a layer of absolute accessibility. Never has the old "a minute to learn, a lifetime to master" adage been truer than it is here. Street Fighter 4 will welcome you with open arms, whether you're a lapsed fan concerned that you've been out of the loop for too long, or you're dipping your toes for the first time. Amazing presentation, intricate and enjoyable fighting gameplay, and long-term appeal with online play make this a must-have. Street Fighter 4 is undoubtedly one of the finest examples of the fighting genre in this generation. So, as you can see, GameSpot showered this fighting game with praise, perhaps even to a level of which I've never seen from them when looking at the history of any fighting game on here previously. Street Fighter 4 ticked every single box for them on what makes a fighting game good. Let's see what IGN had to say on the matter. We love 2D, and we love Street Fighter 3, but the implementation of the new visual style and more accessible gameplay in Street Fighter 4 is close to flawless. This is classic streeties, good pace, nice and accessible, and yet with a truckload of depth. Street Fighter 4 is going to be the game that reinvigorates the series in the eyes of lapsed fans and newcomers alike. Critical praise did not end for the game here though, as PlayStation, the official magazine, rated the game 5 out of 5, while the February 2009 issue of the official Xbox magazine gave Street Fighter 4 a score of 9.5 out of 10. Giant Bomb gave the game a 5 out of 5 stars, stating that Street Fighter 4 combines old and new in powerful ways, resulting in a game familiar enough to bring retired fans back into the fold while being different enough to appeal to the players who have been stuck with the genre since day one. Eurogamer gave the game 10 out of 10, stating that after over a month of playing Street Fighter 4 almost daily, what has become quite clear is that it manages to appeal to a huge range of abilities and tastes without ever compromising its fidelity. As you can tell from all of these glowing reviews, Street Fighter 4 very much delivered the feel of a game Capcom and the developers were hoping for with the title, which was a current generation game inspired by Street Fighter 2. Whilst all the iterations of Street Fighter 3 on the Dreamcast only sold a combined 80,000 units, the first iteration of Street Fighter 4 on its own sold 3.4 million units. If we take the game's further iterations into account, the game sold an incredible 9 million units, making the title by far the most popular fighting game Capcom has released since the original release of Street Fighter 2. Wow. So the plan was executed absolutely perfectly, and Street Fighter had officially taken back its throne atop the fighting game world. The game is arguably the most important fighting game of the 21st century, and for this reason, in future episodes on this channel, we are also going to be looking in depth at what its other iterations brought to the table, as they are all simply too important to overlook. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Street Fighter 4 and how the game saved an entire franchise. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell, as I upload multiple videos like this weekly discussing various elements of retro gaming history. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank all of you very much for that. So huge shout outs go out to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, SpongeMat B, JD Robbins, Sint Spacies, Andrew Bazanski, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Greg Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroVersion.com, House of the Ted, Dan Marlowe Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah.